So with that, I'm going to hand it over to CSAJ's Director of Policy and Law, Lisa Lynn Jacobs. Lisa Lynn, are you with us? Can you hear me?
I am, and I can. I hope that everyone can
All
hear
right.
as well. Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, to everyone. Welcome to this fifth and last in a series for the Legal Impact of Racial and Economic Equity of Survivors Project. We call it for short REAP. This particular webinar is Race Equity in Practice, Learning from Impact Sites for System Change. As Sarah shared when she was giving us a little background, all the additional materials in addition to links to the 4 previous webinars can be found on CSAJ's website, csaj.org. We are so pleased and excited this afternoon to welcome to this webinar the driving engines behind the 2 impact sites that we have been working with for roughly 10 months now. From Enlace Comunitario, Julianne Salinas and Marta Pereira, and from Oklahoma City Artists for Justice, Grace Franklin. Sarah, will you advance, please? So as we are moving into the webinar, I think when people RSVP'd, they answered the question of how racial bias showed up for survivors that they were working with. I'm hopeful, certainly from the feedback that we got, that there are probably folks who have been with us from previous webinars, and even if you haven't, we are very interested in having you share with us how you're addressing racial inequity for survivors in your respective communities. So if there are particular ways in which you are addressing racial inequity, or even ideas that you have or questions, feel free to share those with us in the chat box. Sarah, will you advance, please? I'm now going to turn it over to CSAJ's Executive Director, Erica Sussman, who is going to give us some background about the organization, and then I will be back to talk a little bit more about the REAP program itself. Erica?
Yes, thank you. Lisa Lynn just posed a question to everybody, and so if you have some thoughts or contributions that you want to make along those lines, please feel free to begin chatting some of your responses in the chat box, and we will keep our eyes open and respond to them as they come in. So my name is Erica Sussman, and I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice. Just to give you some background, the vision of CSAJ is toward a world where all people have equal access to physical safety, economic security, and human dignity. And we go about achieving that ambitious vision through our mission, which is to promote advocacy approaches that remove systemic barriers, enhance organizational responses, and improve professional practices to meet the self-defined needs of domestic and sexual violence survivors. CSAJ's work began back in 2006 and was in response to what we witnessed as an increased compartmentalization of violence against women advocacy. And from the experience of working with survivors and advocates and lawyers across the country, it was our intention to engage in and think about how best to implement survivor-centered strategies. Economic justice has been a major focus of our work over the course of the past decade. And so you'll see at the bottom of this slide that there are 3 different projects that have been emerging from that particular focus area. The first is our Consumer Rights for Domestic and Sexual Violence Survivors initiative. The second project is what we'll be talking about today, which is our Racial and Economic Equity for Survivors project, otherwise known as REAP. And then the third project is Accounting for Economic Security, which resulted in an atlas and lots of resources that we'll be talking about at the end of today's program. Sarah, could you advance to the next? Thanks. So just as some background, today's work is related to our newest project, which is called the Race and Economic Equity for Survivors project. And very briefly, before Lisa Lynn gives you a much richer description, the purpose of REAP is to increase grantee capacity to address racial and other structural and institutional biases that pose barriers to economic stability for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. This project is very much a collaboration with our very powerful partners that we work with very closely, and those partners include the Women of Color Network, the Southwest Center for Law and Policy, the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, Casa de Esperanza, the Texas Council on Family Violence, the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, as well as Camille and Bill Kennedy, two expert advisors who have worked very closely with us. And so I now am going to hand it back to Lisa Lynn for some further grounding in the arc of REAP's work.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Erica. And welcome, because I can see that additional participants are joining us as we have been giving these introductory remarks. So I just wanted to spend a moment or two helping to situate the work of the REAP impact sites in the larger context of the work that CSAJ, with the partners that Erica just listed, I wanted to situate the larger arc or the larger piece of work so that you could understand where both the webinar but also the impact sites fit into that. So REAP has a number of component parts, if you will, listed here. The partners started, many of them were known to each other, several of them had worked together before, but in order to embark on this journey together, it was very important, we all felt, to establish a common language so that we were able to communicate what we commonly understood, the concepts and the issues we were working on to mean, things like racial equity and racial justice, etc. About a year ago, we began working on this particular piece, which was to identify two organizations, community-based organizations, that we could work with closely to find out ways in which we knew they were already doing racial equity work, but work with them to identify ways that they wanted to deepen and broaden their work and to figure out whether or not in the context of the organizations that we're partnering with and some of the tools that they use, whether or not there were supports that we could offer to demonstration sites to help them, if you will, take their work to the next level. We then reached out through our partners to lots of community-based organizations to invite them to apply, to tell us more about their work. And right at the end of last year, in December of 2016, we identified our two community-based demonstration site partners who you will be hearing from this afternoon, Enlace Comunitario and OKC Artists for Justice. So in addition to the work that we did, the internal work we did with the partners, the selection of the impact sites, and the selection was particularly vital, I think, because we understood that we wanted regional diversity. We wanted partners who were working in different communities. And as you will learn, Enlace is working with the immigrant community in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and OKC Artists with the African American communities in the Oklahoma City area. We wanted regional diversity. We wanted those communities to have diversity. We have a Native American partner that we have done a lot of work with, the Center for Law and Social Policy. We wanted at minimum to work with organizations that were close to Indian country or had Native partners to some greater or lesser degree in their work, or that in the case of OKC, we knew that the Native community had been so supportive of OKC Artists. So that too was a consideration when we were looking for where to locate the work. As I said, and as you can see, sort of the third bullet here is a series of national webinars, and this is the fifth and last in the series. You can find recorded archived versions of the first 4 webinars in this series. The first was designed to simply introduce the partners and was just titled Racial and Economic Equity for Domestic and Sexual Violence Survivors Project. In that one, all of the partners, not the impact sites, but the project partners who Erica Sussman introduced, got to introduce themselves and their work. That webinar was followed 2 months later by a second webinar, Race Equity Approaches to Domestic and Sexual Violence, where our race equity partners got to talk about how they approach their work, the kinds of tools and supports that they use, the ways in which they are working in the field in general. And I think they did a little bit of discussing in that context about some of the work that they have been doing with the impact sites. The third and fourth webinars in this series had the same title, but showcased different partners. The title was Intersectional Solutions, Advancing Racial and Economic Equity for Survivors. So in those 2 webinars, again, those were the third and fourth, 2 of our partners each in those 2 webinars talked about how they do racial equity work as a domestic and/or sexual violence service provider. So in the first of those 2 webinars, Women of Color Network and Casa de Esperanza partnered to talk about their work and how they do it with a racial equity lens. And in the second of those 2 webinars, the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence and the Texas Council on Family Violence partnered to again talk about how that racial equity lens informs the work that they do in their domestic and sexual violence advocacy. There are 2 additional components, which I will go through briefly, of the REAP project. There's an impact assessment and listening sessions. We have just wrapped up doing some very rich work with a variety of communities in the context of finding out and really looking at practitioners of domestic and sexual violence, advocates, as well as lawyers, finding out how they are doing this work with a racial equity lens, where the challenges are, where the promises are, etc. And finally, we are working to sort of culminate and memorialize this work with a survivor story core and a resource library. So that is the final piece and is a work in progress, if you will. Next slide, please, Sarah. Thank you. So in terms of the impact sites themselves, as I said, we began that work. The sites were selected right at the end of last year. So it was really January of this year that we began the work with our 2 partner sites. You can see the work here reflected basically in 4 phases: gathering voices and planning. We did a series of calls. And the thing that you will see on future slides is that each of our impact sites is supported by an organization that's one of the partners, and additionally by one of our experts in racial equity issues. So for Enlace, the partner is Casa de Esperanza, and the race equity expert is Bill Kennedy. For OKC Artists, the organization is Women of Color Network, and the expert is, I'll come back to that in a moment because I've just blanked. But, oh, right, the expert is the Kirwan Institute. Yes, exactly. It was going to take me a moment. So we began talking to the two impact sites to get a sense of what their work was, what their context was, what their challenges were, and in that way to get a sense of ways in which, with the partnership, we could support the racial equity work that they were already doing. We moved into a period of strategic advocacy, again, finding out more about what they were doing and how we could be supportive, how the racial equity partners could work with them to identify specific tools that might help deepen and broaden the work that they were already engaged in. In the third phase, the idea was to have both demonstration sites hold a community forum. You will hear shortly, Enlace has held its forum. We are working with OKC Artists in the planning of their forum, which will be held later this year. And the purpose of that forum, again, is to help the partner in its particular identified goals, bring to bear some of the skills or the tools, or if they prefer, the training that the race equity partners and the groups who are also doing this work, our partners who are doing this work, to bring to bear those tools and skills so that the communities in which they are working can benefit from those tools and, as appropriate, implement strategies that devolve from those in order to benefit from those in the community. And so finally, phase 4 that we will be moving into, I would say in the next month or so, involves reflecting and strategic learning that sort of will then reflect on and look at the kinds of tools, learnings that have happened since the partnership began, thinking about ways in which some of the challenges that the organizations are facing, and they will talk more about those, whether or not they have the extent to which and ways in which they have found the support and the tools and the training that have been provided in this context to be helpful. So that is the final piece of this work and the piece that we are embarking on going forward. Here you see reflected a few thoughts from both from Enlace and from OKC. You'll be hearing shortly from Grace Franklin, who is the founder and executive director of OKC. And here she's talking about the economic strain on survivors after sexual assault, the fact that there aren't agency supports, talking about the mistrust Black women have of law enforcement and the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, and how those two things mean that women are less likely to seek even the kinds of supports they're eligible for. You also see some reflection shared with us by Enlace's executive director, Antoinette Cedillo Lopez. I think developing a racial equity frame will give us a language to analyze and frame these issues, to make visible what is often invisible to decision makers and sometimes even to the client and ourselves, and help us be more effective in our understanding and our systemic advocacy. Next slide, please. Thank you, Sarah. So it is our hope that at the conclusion of this webinar that participants will have acquired some, or we hope all, of the following, including an understanding and lessons from Enlace and OKC's context and work, summaries of the ways that OKC and Enlace have approached the work, including for Enlace debiasing training, examining court follow-up data, partnership building. For OKC, healing circles and surveys, working in community and within the structure of the Family Justice Center, of which they are a part. We also hope that you will have acquired concrete ways to address racial bias and institutional barriers in your own community context. And finally, we hope that you will also have some new ideas, perhaps, or additional ideas on how to engage partners and build alliances in the context of racial and economic equity for survivors. With that, I am going to turn it over to Julianne Salinas and Marta Pereira from Enlace Comunitario to start us off.
Great, thank you. With Enlace, I'm Associate Director of Administration, and this is
Marta Pereira. I'm the Associate Director with Enlace Comunitario as well. So, Enlace Comunitario is a social organization led by Latino.
Sorry to interrupt, just a quick note. Can you both talk a little closer to your phone maybe? It's sort of garbling a little bit. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, okay. Okay, thank you. So I will talk about Enlace Comunitario and its mission, and our mission. Enlace Comunitario is a social justice organization led by Latina immigrants in central New Mexico that was created in 2000. Our mission is to eliminate domestic violence in the Latino immigrant community and to promote healthy families through comprehensive domestic violence intervention services in Spanish, community education, advocacy policy, and leadership development. And now I will move on to Jules Salina, she will talk a little bit on the history and how Enlace was created.
So our history started, like Marta said, in 2000. There was a woman, Hilda, who's presented here with her then baby daughter, and she was attending a parenting class at the University of New Mexico. It was one of the few classes in Spanish that was provided to mothers, particularly immigrant Spanish-speaking Latinas. And during the class, it was revealed that she was undergoing and she was surviving through domestic violence. And there weren't a lot of resources at the time. The people who were leading the class didn't really know how to address it, didn't know where to send her, didn't really have a lot to go on at the time. And then, in fact, during the course of that parenting class, Hilda was murdered by her partner. And that just highlighted and spotlighted the need for resources, Spanish-speaking resources that didn't exist even throughout the whole state of New Mexico, despite New Mexico being one of the highest density states as far as Spanish-speaking Latina immigrants in the country. And that was for the impetus to start Enlace Comunitario. Even though it started in 2000, we are still the only bilingual Spanish-speaking, English-speaking agency throughout the entire state of New Mexico. And one of the things that we realized is that there is a need for linguistically and culturally specific services, as mentioned. Domestic violence in the Latino immigrant community was not being very well recognized, particularly economic or financial abuse. Economic justice was a huge issue that we recognized early on, and started to dig into why is that so prevalent in the Latino community. And there's a number of reasons, but one of it from a cultural perspective is that the men culturally take care of the finances in the Latino community. And so when there's being power and control exerted over women through financial resources, it's not even often recognized as abuse. It's not leaving a mark. It's not leaving a scar. It's not leaving, bleeding. So there was ignorance on even where to begin. How do we even start to talk about it? The other issue with banks and with banking is that banks are not trusted in the Latino community by and large. There's a historical distrust of many financial institutions across most Latino countries. There's the sort of keep it in the mattress mentality rather than put it in a bank, because many banks in our countries of origin have either gone under with no notice and people are not able to get their money back out, or they are notoriously not fair and in lending practices. I'm trying to be kind. So in the United States, many of the banks won't work with clients without a social security number. So it became important for us to identify banks and credit unions, and primarily credit unions, frankly, that would work with people with I-10 numbers, particularly survivors who are needing to be able to get banked. And then, of course, there's the additional barrier of language. And that's something that transcends, of course, justice systems, legal systems, financial systems, housing. There's an intersectionality across all of it, and that same discrimination and racism, not just for do you have a social security number, but now under the new administration, you know, there's even additional things. So, for example, if somebody is fleeing and they're at a hotel and they go to a Motel 6, there's, as we know, it rapidly went through our community, people that are calling from Motel 6 to report them to ICE as being suspected, undocumented, and that sort of thing. So the whole idea of which CJC looks at as physical safety, economic security, and human dignity are all, of course, under severe threat and challenge at the moment for the Latino immigrant community. So our services that we have here in response to that are, we have counseling, we provide case management, we have legal services, including a great partnership with the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. And then we have children and family services that has been growing by leaps and bounds over the last 3 years or so to really help the children and the families from both parenting classes and us also working directly with the children. We have a child advocate who provides child case management. We have children counselors. We have groups. We have all kinds of sources now. We have a music class to do music therapy with the children who have been exposed to it. Because one of the things that we see and we recognize, or we are starting to see, is that ACEs, adverse childhood events, are prevalent amongst both our survivors as well as their children, and many of the children are currently experiencing those adverse childhood events. One of the adverse childhood events that's not being discussed is also immigration stress, and the stress of immigration and potential deportation of a parent or themselves that we think needs to be going on to that adverse childhood event spectrum. And of course, then we also have our prevention services, and that includes our promotoras, our promotores, our youth leaders, community classes and presentations and outreach. And this starts to get into the discussion, and we'll have more hopefully later on talking about the need for male allies and trying to make a difference in that in terms of a social impact, which gets to our theory of change. We believe that immigrants that have been affected by domestic violence and clients of ours are they're the best people to go to for their own success, but that it goes through this spectrum, right, of needing to go through intervention services, connecting the client to resources, increasing their personal growth and understanding, and then developing leadership. And then as you go from developing the leadership, it goes back out into the community, educating the community and service providers about what the needs are, networking and deepening those relationships, institution and policy level changes, which we'll speak more about in a moment, and then new social norms. And that really is where our prevention services really, I think, thrive. So the current challenges that are exacerbating issues. When Rosie Hidalgo came out and did our training along with Bill Kennedy, one of the things that she mentioned was that the policies that are going on right now are sharpening the tool of abusers. And we have seen that. We feel like we are sort of existing under a trifecta of disdain from the current administration, all because we're Latinos, we're domestic violence survivors, and we're immigrants. And that's the three areas that are being challenged at every turn, right? We've seen that in specific cases. For example, there was a case here in New Mexico, where a survivor, a domestic violence survivor, was being supported by her adult son, who was a DACA recipient. The abuser knew that the DACA recipient was unable to renew his DACA status at the time because it was either, I think, financial or it was just running out. And so he reported that DACA recipient son, the older son, to ICE, and ICE detained the son. When the woman was vulnerable, because her adult son was detained, the abuser, the perpetrator, began stalking her again, and then within a couple of weeks killed her. And so we've seen actual, use of that sharpened tool by abusers, as Rosie put it, by using these policies. There's exceedingly increased fear in the community with regards to ICE. It's enabled abusers to continue doing what they do because they know that women are afraid to report, that the reports will be used against the survivors. There's even a recent, come and get your permanent residency card. And then when the people showed up to get their permanent residency card, they were taken into custody. So there's this incredible fear in the community that keeps being perpetrated. The other thing, as we spoke about, is DACA. One of the key priorities that has been identified in our community is the need for family unity. And that can be even at the expense of the survivor, even though they may want their perpetrator or their abuser to face consequences, they don't necessarily want to do it at the expense of never having them see their children again. So that's one of those things. And one of our community partners is IIF, which looks at savings and how people are spending their money in our community. And prior to this administration, they were saving for housing, they were saving for education, they were saving for business investment. And now those savings are being shifted into deportation and detainment defense. So we're seeing that as well. Another thing that we're seeing is the framing of domestic violence as a pre-existing condition. In one of the versions of Trump Care, there was concerns that, and there's concerns that it'll come back, domestic violence and sexual assault survivors were being cast as having pre-existing conditions. And so that also leads to a chilling effect on reporting. And then there's additional uncertainties regarding funding and support going forward. That has been exacerbated by the threats to cuts, to organizations such as ours, or to municipalities such as ours, rather, where they are immigrant-friendly, both county and city, and yet the government is threatening to cut off funding to them based on that. So those are some of the challenges that we're seeing under the current administration, and that's leading to that doubt and fear. So it's also exacerbating what was already kind of under the surface. This was a picture taken from a protest that happened prior to the new administration because we were seeing increased police violence. And so there was a feeling that there was issues already with racial inequity in the system. And so we started within the last couple of years providing training on domestic violence to the APD, the Albuquerque Police Department, highlighting the issues of language and cultural barriers, and now ICE. And that actually led to why did we ask for this training, right? Because originally we thought we were making headway into that. And then when we were doing this training, one of the comments that came out was, well, we're not racist. We, Albuquerque Police Department, aren't racist. You're racist because you're asking for special considerations, and I'm putting that in quotes. When we really weren't. We were just trying to, teach them about how language and culture and bias plays into, the system. And we were coming up against walls. And so while we initially wanted training on framing, it quickly shifted over to, no, we really need to have debiasing training. And so Rosie from Casa de Esperanza and Bill Kennedy came out, and it was amazing. And we had a really great group of attendees. including Asian Family Center, Central Savila, which provides bilingual counseling as well as other services, the Mayor's Office, the Albuquerque Police Department, Casa Fortaleza, which provides sexual assault services in Spanish. It was really well received. And we shared, and we'll share at the end of this presentation, the tools and some of the resources that we received during that training. It touches barely on the surface because it was so deep and impactful. And it's great because now we're able to use that going forward as we do trainings again next month with the police department. There's already those seeds that have been sown as far as understanding that when we're talking about race, that we're not judging and we're not criticizing them just to have this conversation, but really that there are, issues of bias that transcend across everybody. So we need to hold everybody accountable, but also really incorporate that into the police department trainings and all of our other interactions with them. In the future, we were asked, what do we see in the future? And one of the things that we see is that there's going to be an influx of political and environmental refugees that are going to need culturally and linguistically targeted services from Puerto Rico, from Colombia, from Honduras, from Ecuador, no, not Ecuador, no, to some extent, but across Central and South America, we expect to see political in a continued influx. And Martha and I were talking about this earlier. And one of the things she noted was like, we already have, they're here. We have a number of political refugees and from El Salvador, from Guatemala, even parts of Mexico. So it's not something that's on the far horizon. This is something that's happening here and now. And so we expect that this year too, for us here at Enlace, it's going to be one of reflection, of grounding, getting back to our source and our mission, not looking so much for program expansion, but really a deepening of the relationships that we have and to sort of gird our loins for whatever is coming, because there's a lot of uncertainty even amongst the agency as far as what do funding resources look like? What are the needs looking like? So we really want to get back to making sure that all of our programs that are in place as of right now are as strong as they can be and continue to be made stronger going forward, right? And so this is Martha and I, our contact information. And if you download this presentation, you can call us and ask us any questions. We'll be glad to give tours. We've had people come in from across the country and actually across the world. We have relationships with other organizations that are international-based organizations, and we've just met with someone from the Uzbekistan, a couple of weeks ago, and that was amazing. And to see the need across both the country and the world for these culturally and linguistically specific services. So if you have any questions, otherwise I will give back control.
Excellent. Thanks so much, both Jules and Martha. Are there particular questions that folks from the audience have that they'd like to pose at this time? If so, please put them in the chat box. We will also be taking questions at the end, but thought we would give an opportunity to ask questions at this time. Okay, hearing none immediately, I will turn it over to Grace Franklin, the Executive Director and Founder of OKC Artists for Justice, to share with us her journey and her experience. Grace, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Grace Franklin. I am a co-founder and the Executive Director of OKC Artists for Justice. We are a nonprofit organization that was organized many moons ago in the Daniel Holtzclaw case. Part of our mission is we are a nonprofit. We address violences committed against African American women through advocacy, education, and support in the state of Oklahoma. We also advocate for the rights of women to be all women to be physically, culturally, economically, and spiritually safe. So we are an organization who is in a red state. One of the regional issues we are in a red state, very conservative, it is not a melting pot of various cultures at times in this state. So part of our mission is to change some things in this state. We were founded around the Daniel Holtzclaw case. Daniel Holtzclaw was a Oklahoma City police officer who sexually assaulted and raped African-American women in the lowest income section of Oklahoma City. And it was a very specific section of Oklahoma City, which is very important because in that area, in low income areas, women in those areas many times have had contact with the system. They have low education, they're limited education, and they have limited economic standing, which makes them extraordinarily vulnerable to rape and assault, particularly from people in power. So with that case, when it began, what we noticed was that there wasn't enough outrage. There wasn't enough crying out. There wasn't enough, oh my goodness. We literally had a police officer who was a serial rapist. That is almost unheard of. You cannot even think of another situation where this happened, but there was no attention on it. So we had a fear that we would look up a year later and then all of a sudden he would get, like 6 months on probation and nothing would happen. So we learned a few things from the Holtzclaw case. Number one, there were 13 Black women who testified. We definitely believe that there were more women than that. They're just unable to come forward. Another thing that we noticed was the privilege of officers. In the case, in the beginning, there were 10 women who accused him. He had a $5 million bail and it was reduced to $500,000. That in itself was remarkable because we were talking about 10 women who actually accused him and then the charges were filed. Charges aren't filed without evidence, so the evidence was there. He had paid leave before termination, which has always been an issue for many communities when they have a police officer who's being accused of a felony, that they're still getting paid until they're terminated. And then in this case, he violated the bond. So he was on house arrest. He violated that. He went somewhere without informing the people he should. And any person of color or in low income, even a white person who's poor and who's been on house arrest or knows someone who has, they know that if you violate that, there is no going back to it. You immediately go back to jail and your bond is revoked. That didn't happen in this case. He got a second chance. And that part is important because it speaks to the historical issue that the African American community has with the institution of law enforcement, that there is a distinct feeling that there are privileges handed to officers that are not afforded to most people in the Black community. And then there was a lack of national attention. We believe the lack of attention was based upon the fact that the victims did not fit a certain stereotype because they were poor and Black, and some of them had contact with the justice system. They weren't necessarily camera ready. So we pushed back on that and demanded that there was attention brought on the case, which we needed to have because we needed the spotlight here. And then there was the lack of visible support from local agencies. So there are larger organizations here. And, I always like to say this was our bump in the road and we have moved past this in many ways and we've worked to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Yet initially, when this happened, there was not a visible display of support from the larger organizations. And that does include the YWCA, Also, the National Organization of Women did not show up visibly. We're not saying in the background, because they were definitely there helping with survivors, but we needed visible support, and it wasn't there. And in the end, they were definitely there. We talked about it, but that's an issue. That's one of the issues with women of color and the larger national organizations, that sometimes African American women don't feel like we are a part of the larger conversation. So those things were worked upon. So those are the lessons from the Holtzclaw case. After the case, we had to decide what we were going to do. And what we found was there was a great need to change policies and procedures. One of the policies that we did get changed with the Oklahoma City Police Department is when an officer is accused of sexual assault, or he's accused of domestic violence on a civilian, that the department that will investigate him is based on the charge that he has. So if it's a sexual assault charge, then the sexual assault unit handles the investigation. And if it's domestic violence, the domestic violence unit handles the investigation, opposed to internal affairs, that those detectives may not have any history or experience with those cases. So that's one thing that we did get changed in the Oklahoma City Police Department. And then we also advocate for changes in legislation. One of the things that we found that was supremely needed was healing. You know, when we talk about trauma, many points of trauma, we have to talk about, well, how do we help? How do we get this from point A to point B? And what we decided to do, because many of us are artists, is to use art as a form of healing. So we began healing circles. In those healing circles, we do journaling, poetry, art, and they were great ways for women to just express themselves, not to be bound by any sense of shame or any sense of having to do something specific. You know, it really was about expression and about letting them deal with the trauma in the way they needed. So art expression, we have the healing circles, we learn about journaling techniques and color expression. And this is one of the art pieces from one of our circles that was done by one of our members. So in doing the healing circles, what we learned is that there's a lot of violence that Black women experience throughout their lifetime. Some of it they see, some of it they experience, some of it is seen through media. When you have police officers who are slamming young girls out of desks, when you have the consistent violence that happens. So we wanted to see and really get some definite information about what Black women experience in terms of domestic violence, sexual assault, and violence, period. And so we started Sanctuary Redefined, and it began as a celebration of women who are overcoming various things in their lives, domestic violence survivors, sexual assault survivors. But then we realized, you know what, there has to be some cultural emphasis in the healing process. And sometimes that doesn't always happen. When we speak to survivors, sometimes they don't feel comfortable going into certain situations when they're not faces that look like their own. They don't feel comfortable talking to people who may not really understand. And it's not the other person's fault. It's not an issue of saying, you all don't know what you're doing. You all are, you know, racist or prejudiced against Black people. That's not the point. The point is sometimes there are barriers that can prohibit someone from getting help that they need. So what we did, we built surveys. And in these surveys, they ask women specifically about, you know, their lives, what they've experienced. And we're getting this information for a specific purpose. We want the voices of survivors and witnesses to violence. One of the things that we also have to remember is there are a lot of people who grow up sometimes in domestic violence situations. The witnessing of that at young ages can change how you view yourself, change how you view your worth. And we want that information from survivors and witnesses of. We also want to be a bridge. Part of what we are, we don't provide services. What we do is we extend a bridge to people who can provide services. So with the Family Justice Center, what we try to do in that area is point people to the right direction. So if you're saying you have a problem legally, if you're saying that you want to file the VPO or a victim protection order, is what they call it here in Oklahoma, then this is the person who can help you do that. We are a bridge to services, but we also want to be a bridge for providers to understand what they need to change in order to get more African-American women in those places that they need to be. And the other purpose of it is education. Part of what we do are forums, and our forums in the community are to give people the information, are to let them know the fatality rate is disproportionate in Oklahoma for Black women when it comes to domestic violence, interpersonal relationship, homicide. It's disproportionate. That's a problem. We want to discuss ways that women can come out of these situations and how families can help in doing that. Part of educating the community is learning as a family, learning as a community how to help women come out of violent situations without making it worse. So though that is the purpose of those surveys and the purpose of Sanctuary Redefined, which also includes artistic components as well. So in moving forward, one of the things that we definitely want to do is take all of this information and be able to present it in various ways. Media, we want to be able to discuss it, and eventually we want to start training providers and also training law enforcement on some things they really need to be aware of culturally when dealing with African American women. One of the main reasons that African American women do not call the police is because we do have to talk about the historic effects and the historic problems we have with law enforcement. So if I call the police and they come, what if there's interaction with my husband or my partner? What if there's an interaction with me in the police department where I'm injured or killed, or he's injured or killed, and now we have additional pressure? Those are very real and very substantial fears that prohibit women from getting help. So many times African American women don't call until we are at a lethality rate that we are literally about to be killed. You know, that type of interaction has to stop. So we do have to start talking to the police department more about training, about interacting with our communities, interacting in domestic violence situations where the cultures may be different, and really understanding how historic relationships affect today. So that is what we do. Moving forward, we plan to definitely build bridges and communication with other organizations for all women of color, so we can really have those larger discussions and talk about the similarities in communities and issues with getting help and providers providing services where it's really needed, and also you know, just commonalities and really understanding that culture can be a barrier when it's not considered in a way that is about humanizing people and respecting people, and understanding that there could be a barrier there. And it's a barrier that costs people's lives, and it's something that we have to discuss. So this is our contact information. You can definitely email us directly. That's our email address. This is my personal email address, franklingracie@gmail.com. And I did put a note on here. All the artwork that you saw on here is by Tiffany Nicole. She is one of our, she's on our board of directors and one of the artists that help us in the healing circles. So yeah, that's about it for me. That's it.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Grace. Thanks to both OKC Artists for Justice and Enlace Comunitario for their very rich discussion of their work in community and the origins and the ways in which they are taking that forward in this particular climate. I know that we have a number of questions from the audience. I think we're also going to hear a little bit of discussion from the panelists among themselves, but Grace, you were just in particular mentioning how the artwork, I think, has come about in the context of OKC Artists doing this work with survivors. And I saw that someone in the comment had expressed interest in learning more about how one might facilitate healing sessions or opportunities on the parts of survivors to engage in healing via the arts. Can you share a little bit more about how OKC does that work?
Absolutely. In the beginning, what we wanted to do, and one thing that we've learned is as artists, we want to do everything at one time, right? So we want to have the artistic component where we have survivors drawing and expressing. We want to talk about writing. We want to talk about journaling. And what we found is that it's better sometimes to start with one aspect of the artistic component. So what we do is we gather a group of women, and usually it's women. Initially, we had women that we knew individually, and some of our partners had worked with, and we got references from them for some women who may be interested. And we gathered them in a space, and we talked about doing, of course, before as an organization, we talked about what we wanted to do in this circle. What is the purpose of it? Is the purpose for them to reflect on what happened, or are we really looking at giving them tools to express what happened and how they feel now? And that's what we decided to do, was allow expression of how they feel and also giving tools. So on the first healing circle we actually didn't do journaling. The first one we did, we only did art, which allowed us to see how much time it took, what worked best, and we started that way. Now, our person that handles the creative aspect, like the actual art and painting and watercolors, she has experience in art expression. So she actually was a counselor before she came, and she used art in her work. So what she did basically was, one of the things that she did was allowed women to have various paints. We talked a bit, opened up a bit, and then we went directly into painting. And they painted 3 things in the first healing circle we had. They painted before the trauma, during the trauma, and after the trauma. And it was an excellent way for us to gauge 2 things, how much time we needed and what worked best. And then for the next healing circle, we did writing. And then in the third one, we figured out enough time so we could do both. And so to answer the question, a great way to start, I think, is to start with a small group and just find somebody who has experience with people who are dealing with trauma, because that's the other thing that's really important, is to understand once you start talking about feelings come up, and there has to be space for people to express that and feel that, but you also have to facilitate them moving forward. So it's really important to have people in the room, even if it's not the artist, even if it's somebody else, to really help facilitate the pushing forward to the hope and the current part.
Okay.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Grace. I think that I'm looking back here through the questions as well. I think that Jules and Martha were talking or responding a little bit to a separate question about financial abuse. And I think there may be some perhaps general questions here about how people are working with survivors who have, you know, perhaps problematic credit histories for reasons that we all know, maybe limited credit, maybe bad credit, things of that nature. Jules, Marta, do you have particular insights to share, materials you might be working with to recommend? Also for you, Grace, if you've got particular approaches to that you wish to share. But since Jules had started to answer the question, perhaps she could start.
Yeah, so we have a PROSPER program. I forget at the moment what it stands for. It's an acronym, but basically it's our financial literacy program. And it came out of, a few years ago, we had an Avon grant to provide financial literacy. And there were great aspects to that program, and then there was not so great aspects to it. And, you know, one of the things that we really strongly believe in is about, you know, of self-evaluation and looking at program evaluation. And when we got out of that grant, one of the things that we came to recognize, and Marta can speak more to this, was that there was an IDA component, an individual development account component, and we were working with a local community partner to put that through. But that IDA required that the clients, I'm looking at Marta just to make sure that I'm saying this right, save for education, to purchase a house, or to
Start their own business.
Start their own business, right? And so while that's great, and it was a 4-to-1 match, which was amazing. And I'll let Marta go ahead, because you can speak to it from firsthand experience.
Yeah, so and working with the IDA program initially that was funded through Avon, we were able to identify some of the barriers that survivors were, you know, they usually come in a crisis. So at the time, their basic need is the priority. So at that time, they're not ready to start their own business, purchase a home, or, you know, go back to school. So some of the barriers that we identified with the program was that they needed to attend 12 sessions of financial literacy classes. They needed to create the business plans, and survivors were not ready for that. So we decided to, after the program ended, we decided to seek different fundings that would be able to, for us to start our own program, eliminating some of the barriers that we had identified with the previous program. So we started a safety saving account, a PROSPER program, and we're advocates are working individually and also workshops with survivors using the all-state curriculum in Spanish. And what they're doing is they're saving, we're identifying, working on a budgeting, we're identifying their income, their expenses, and just assisting them and see if they're able to save up on a monthly basis depending on what their income is. And then we match that amount up to $500 currently. And so we've assisted, I think this past year, it was the first year that we started the program, and it was a success. We were able to enroll 18 survivors, and out of the 18, 14 of those survivors were first-time bankers. So during the process, we've been able to identify credit unions that work with IT numbers that are more survivor-friendly, specifically, you know, with culturally specific issues that our survivors are dealing with. So the program has been a success, and we received different funding again. So we will continue working with the survivors, but the match has increased from $500 to $1,000, and so we're in the process of working on that.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Are there particular economic strategies or approaches that you're aware of or that you're using that you would like to share at this time, Grace?
Well, at this time, we are looking at various strategies. One of the first things that we're looking at right now is really discussing it. Like, there is absolutely no discussion, I think, in African-American communities about financial abuse. That is, it's a different type of taboo because women don't really discuss finances. So when we talk about financial abuse and what it looks like, many times that discussion gets abruptly cut off because it's such a personal issue that even explaining why this is abusive behavior is where we are right now. Explaining why, you know, when your credit score is going from 700 to 500 based on purchases that you're making for someone else, why that's a problem when you don't have a choice in it, why it's a problem if you don't have access to your checkbook, your debit card, or if you have any government assistance, you don't have access to that card. Another person is controlling that. Many times, I think in the African-American community, there is such a push to have the male presence in the house and that he is supposed to be the head of the house, that this line of questioning how finances are happening is something that we're still just kind of peeling the scab off a little bit. The discussion of physical abuse is, or emotional abuse even, is a bubbling topic. Financial abuse is still very foreign in most people's vocabulary. So we're just starting to get information and get procedures, and also to get a better sense of explaining what it is for our community. So that's where we are right now.
Great. Thanks so much. So I see a question here, which is fairly similar, I think, to one that we had planned to tackle as well. It's asking whether or not OKC and Enlace could talk a little bit about how you're building partnerships as you work on tackling institutional change, and how those partnerships are connected to, I guess, enhancing accountability for survivors of color and immigrants. I think Sarah has shared with us the way that we had put together that question, so maybe you could sort of weave together the strands, both of the question that we have gotten from the participant and what's here. If either group wants to begin, we have also, in the context of our work together, talked about media and framing issues and the relationship and advocacy with systems. Can you talk a little bit more about your approaches, your lessons learned, successes, etc.?
Sure. Do you want us to go first, Grace, or you want to take this one first?
Or you all can take it first. I'm trying to get these phones under control here. Go ahead.
Okay. So we have partnerships with about 50 local organizations at different levels. Of course, some are much more profound and active than others. But two of the big ones, I would say, one of them is called La Red, which works within the South Valley. And that is to really focus on bringing economic justice to Latinos and Latina immigrants in the South Valley, which is one of the most economically challenged areas of Albuquerque. And so because of that, we work with, I want to say, at least 10 other organizations, including IIF, who we mentioned earlier, that studies the effects of, or how people are saving and spending their money. Prosperity Works, Central Savila. There's Mayor's Task Force. So there's about 10 organizations, many of which actually came to our training when we had it with Rosie and Bill. And because there is such a need and understanding for debiasing across all the systems and that. So when we have these relationships, it's great to be able to extend our programs such as the REAP program and the resources that we're getting from them to them, getting from REAP to our partner organizations, because everybody really felt like they benefited from it. So that's one of the ways that we deepen those relationships. Another organization that we work very closely with is Centro de Igualdad y Derechos here in Albuquerque. And one of their initiatives recently was the Healthy Family Initiative, which was we finally got it on the ballot after being thrown off the ballot in 2016, which would have been much better. And the Healthy Family Initiative was to work to give all workers the opportunity to earn PTO, because there is such a link between economic justice and social justice, right? And so there was a component of it that said, look, if you can earn PTO, then you can use it for domestic violence and sexual assault if you're a victim of domestic violence and sexual assault. So of course we were behind it. Some people would say, well, there's already a component that allow for sexual assault and domestic violence if I were to use your PTO. Well, that's great, and that is in the law. However, over 107,000 people in thank you for that. 107,000 people in Albuquerque do not receive the opportunity to earn PTO or paid time off. A majority of those are women and women of color, and so that is a huge issue where we see, where we can identify those intersections and work together to, achieve justice or to work towards justice in this case. That's another way that we deepen those partnerships and sort of broaden the conversation beyond domestic violence, and to show that domestic violence and our work with, we are first and foremost a social justice organization that works with Latino immigrants, to stop violence overall, is with focus, of course, on domestic violence and building healthy families. That the building of healthy families and the working to end domestic violence and violence in general in the Latino community is not a myopic focus. We can't be just focused on one area. We have to look in all the different areas, in particular economic justice and environmental justice and so many other issues. So that's where we work on. We work on the intersections.
Great. Thanks so much, Jules. Grace, are there particular ways in which you are working on your relationships, with other advocates, other groups? You talked a little bit about law enforcement. Are there other things you want to share with us about the way in which you're working, lessons learned, aspirations, perhaps?
Yes. So we have a working relationship, as I like to call it, with the police department. We also work heavily with BLM Oklahoma, Black Lives Matter Oklahoma, because there are some racial justice issues that we still tackle. And we also are building relationships in the Native communities. We do have some activists that we work closely with in the Indigenous communities and Native communities, but we are striving to get those better relationships with the organization side of that community. So when it's time to go up for legislation, there can be more people there to support. The goal is to have as many connections with communities of color as we can in this state. It is imperative that we do it. One of the things that we want and we're aspiring to is to show up for people in different communities in ways that they need, so they can show up for us. Part of the issue in Oklahoma is the separation. We are very segregated. as far as communities of color. I'm sure we're not the only place, but it's pretty hard sometimes to cross lines. Not because people aren't willing, it's just sometimes we don't have the location or the opportunity to connect.
Mm-hmm.
So what we've learned is that we have to be proactive in doing that. We have to be willing to discuss with organizations and really learn about other cultures as well, so we can find those common threads so we can work together. So that's where we are right now. We do have great relationships with specific organizations, African American organizations here, of course, and with activists in various communities. But we want to start building those stronger and longer relationships with organizations, those nonprofits and those for-profit organizations that are in Native and Indigenous communities, and also in Hispanic and Latino communities here. So that's what we're doing now, is trying to build those bridges so we can have a better alliance.
Great. Excellent. Thanks so much, Grace. I see that there's another question for you in particular, although Jules and Marta, you may have experience with this as well. Someone is asking about whether you have experience supporting survivors who are interested in restorative justice or restorative circles as another form of healing. I was going to say, go ahead. I was going to say, while you were thinking about that, I could sort of share my sense of what that is or what that looks like, but
Okay.
It sounds like you have some ideas. No, please go ahead.
No, go ahead. Well, for restorative healing, from my experience, is really about, it's a little more, it's about there's different components that are used other than art, right? So there's a lot of discussion about energy, about healing what was damaged or what was abused in the time of trauma. And for those circles, we have not had one. We have not facilitated one yet. We plan, but in that type of healing circle, we want to be very careful and very sure we have all the components available. I've experienced them, I've been to them, and we have a few other people who have as well. And it's a different type of healing experience, and it's very powerful, extraordinarily powerful. We just want to make sure that all the components that we'll need for that type of healing circle or series, because it would really be more like a series of circles, because we would need the women to come back again so we could move further and further on. So we haven't done that yet. We're looking at that closely to kind of see how we would format it. A restorative healing circle. So we haven't done it yet, but we are looking at venturing into that type of healing, which for us would not be like a one session. That would have to be something that we do maybe 3 or 4 times consecutively with the same group of women.
Excellent. I see that we are at 2:25. We may run over just slightly, just to warn the audience and express the hope that they can stay with us. That as has been the case with all 5 of these webinars, there is so much interest and engagement that we get really excited about responding to all the questions. So I'm going to throw out what I was thinking about with respect to restorative justice. And Grace, if you have more thoughts, or Marta and Jules, if you have thoughts, maybe we can make this the last question and then move into wrap up. So restorative justice, at least in terms of the way that I have worked with the term in the last several years, I think we all know what the criminal justice system is and what it does, right? It is punitive in nature. It is generally focused on holding a perpetrator accountable. And the state sort of stands in and prosecutes a case on behalf of a survivor or a victim or something. Restorative justice is much more centered on what a survivor needs to be restored, to be made whole. So it may be, often these contexts come up a lot in the discussions around campus violence. So it's a question about whether or not a survivor needs counseling, needs to take time off, needs to drop a class, things of that nature, which are victim-centered. It may also include, and has in some contexts and communities, the creation of some kind of forum where a survivor may choose, and I want to underline that very clearly. I am not talking about mediation where a court requires this or anything else, but if a survivor chooses that they want to sit down with a perpetrator and, you know, maybe have a conversation or a facilitated discussion, or to demand some specific types of accountability directly from the perpetrator, that is a form of restorative justice. Sometimes restorative justice considerations involve restoring a perpetrator to relationship with his or her community as well. I'm a little bit more familiar with that in terms of having read about it as opposed to having participated in it. So I don't know if any of those concepts ring any bells, or if either organization has other things they'd like to raise in this context.
We don't really use the restorative justice model. We do have when we are putting on our BIP, our Betters Intervention programs, there is an aspect, a very huge aspect of accountability, but it's not the same thing, and the survivors are not involved in that. And you know, one of the concerns always is that the justice system tends to say, well, why don't they just put them into, you know, couples counseling? And there's violence on both sides, and we are so strongly opposed to that suggestion because we just don't see it as being a balanced issue. So, and not to say that there can't be violence against men, there absolutely can be, and we do have male clients. It's just that 98% of our clients are women, and when there is violence against men, either by women or other men, it tends to be a very different dynamic. So we don't really employ the restorative justice model here in our experience.
Understood. Thank you. Grace, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to share in this space, or with that particular, looking at things through that particular lens.
No, I think restorative justice is a great component of the healing, and it's also a great component of educating communities and institutions, because restorative justice will require attention on the perpetrator, and that has to happen as well. And not in a coddling sense, but a really taking accountability for their actions.
Right.
Part of the restorative justice for sexual assault victims and domestic violence is that the perpetrators have to be held accountable via the law, via the community, via society. And that is not happening as well as it should. So restorative justice, or the restorative component of this discussion, is needed, and I think it has to be addressed, and it has to include the perpetrator. It has to include them in a way that does not soften or not whitewash, but it doesn't add roses and beautiful smells. It doesn't become a couple's issue. It becomes a perpetrator's. It is and remains a perpetrator's issue, not the survivor's issue.
Right. Agreed. Very much an accountability issue. Excellent. So with that, one of the things that we asked our two demonstration sites to do was to share with us so that we could share with you some resources in terms of some of the things that they have shared. We're going to put up a slide about that in just a moment. So you can see here, there are materials about implicit bias, which might give a little bit of insight into particularly some of the work that Enlace has been doing around debiasing. There's an article here from the Washington Post on racism. There are a couple of pieces here. DOJ HUD HHS joint letter on immigration services. One of our partners, the API Institute on Gender-Based Violence, has shared an FAQ on immigration enforcement and victim services programs. And also the Department of Justice about 2 years ago put out guidance on preventing gender bias in law enforcement. And how it was also designed to help law enforcement understand how they could better respond to issues around sexual and domestic violence. So there's a link to that here as well. I particularly want to thank both of our participants, our demonstration site participants today, OKC Artists Alliance for Justice, Enlace Comunitario. I think that we have a few more resources, CSAJ-centered resources to share as well, including some information on forthcoming materials from us.
Great. Yes, this is Sarah again. And before I pass it back to Erica to talk about those a little bit, I want to echo thanks to Grace, Marta, Jules, and all of you for joining us as we run through these resources. And as you leave us for now, I want to encourage you to, you should receive a link to do an evaluation. And I really want to encourage you to not only complete that, but to share some of your thoughts and questions with us. Those are a big part of our work, and we will share them back with Enlace and OKC for further questions, for follow-up, for more resources, for technical assistance, and just to get a sense of where you are and help steer our work, since we are grounded in that. So please take some time to share with us your thoughts, and thank you very much. I'll pass it back to you, Erica, to close us out.
Wonderful. Yes, also deep gratitude to everybody for all of your contributions today. I want to say how much I appreciate just this last focus, in particular upon the idea of restoration and justice, because I think what the work of both impact sites have highlighted today is really the question of what does restoration look like when the state is one of the violent actors and when systems are either enabling or facilitating the violence, which of course requires a focus on institutional and systems change, which is exactly what both Enlace and OKC Artists have done so skillfully and powerfully. So thank you all for your questions, and thank you both for all of your insights on that front. Yes, as promised, we have some more resources to share with you. One is the ongoing Margins to Center listening sessions that we've just recently held in the month of September, and which have really focused on creating some dialogue across the field to inform survivor-driven systems advocacy and practice recommendations. So it has been very meaningful work, and it will be culminating in a report back to the field. So please keep your eyes open for that. Coming up, let's see, what do we have on our list here. I encourage you to take a peek at our library archives where all of the webinars that Lisa Lynn had mentioned are housed, and today's webinar will be there as well, along with all of the materials from those webinars. So lots of good stuff. And again, in December, keep your eyes open for a report and lessons learned resulting from our listening sessions and other aspects of our REAP project. This resource for folks, especially the folks who had asked about economic strategies in particular, earlier this year, CSAJ released a guidebook that was really written by and for advocates in the field, a guidebook on consumer and economic civil legal advocacy strategies. And you can access this resource on our website covering a range of topics, and you can see some of them here. Also, just want to highlight our also recently released resource on accounting for economic security. It's an atlas for direct service providers. And this first map book of the atlas is really focused on mapping the economic terrain. And so you'll see these different points listed here. And what this first map book does is really collect and present data that tries to give a richer sense of what the landscape looks like facing survivors and what some of the challenges are, really so that advocates and programs can engage in a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how we address our economic advocacy. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And then here are another handful of resources from CSAJ. One is our National Needs Assessment Report that focuses on better addressing the economic needs of survivors. Another is an article on the economic ripple effect and how to really address the profound economic harms that often result from abuse and poverty more generally. Another is our pilot site report that came out back in, I think, 2014, that is all about offering up some promising practices to build partnerships for economic justice. And then this last resource here is a tool for lawyers and advocates to assess sort of where you are in terms of meeting the economic needs of survivors, both within your organization and in your community. So lots of good resources, and we encourage you to check it out and share back with us about how you've used them and how it's had an impact in your own work. With all of that, I want to thank you all once again. Thank you to Grace and Jules and Marta, and of course, thanks to Lisa Lynn for facilitating today's conversation, and to Sarah for organizing and keeping us on track and pulling all of this rich data together. And of course, thanks to OVW for making today's programming possible, as well as to each and every one of you for all of the work that you're doing each day. Thank you very much.